Hey nerds, what's up? So Guardian just put out a list of the 100 best books and it made people angry. Honestly, I've been thinking about these 100 best books lists for years because it seems like anytime any publication releases them, people are always angry about it. I saw the other day that Man Carrying Thing beat me to the punch about this Guardian article, and his video is fantastic and I agree with everything he said, and I highly recommend you watch it. It will be funnier than this video. However, I decided I did still have stuff to say, so I'm going to move forward. The first question I always have when these lists come out is just like, how often can we really make these lists? It seems like a new one comes out every year, and in my opinion, you really can't make changes to 100 best books of all time more than like once a decade. So I kind of did a deep dive to see how often, for example, has Guardian put out one of these lists. And this was a lot more difficult than I expected it to be. It turns out news sites really don't want to offer you up old articles, which makes sense because if you are a news site, you're obviously relying on providing news, which is new. It's in the name. However, it does make it very frustrating when you're trying to do research on how people felt at a certain time, or in this case, how many best 100 lists have you put out? With the help of Google and date ranges, I did end up coming up with Guardian having done 3 of these articles, one in 2002, one in 2015, and the most recent one in 2026. So actually they kind of followed my general idea that you could only do one a decade. Now there were a lot of lists in between there, but as they had different qualifications, like one was just the 21st century, I only counted ones that were seemingly to look at all time. I think why it feels like we're getting one of these lists every single year is that between every publication doing them, we are. If every major publication waits 10 years, but you could do one a year, it feels like we just get kind of inundated with these kind of lists. So I wanted to run some numbers on this, and I ended up focusing on The Guardian because that's kind of the newest list, although I'm sure we could do something interesting like this for every major publication. But one of the questions I had was how much overlap is in these lists? Because yes, they were a decade apart, but when you think about 20 years in the terms of the entire history of literature, 20 years is pretty much a drop in the bucket. So technically, shouldn't these lists be pretty similar? Well, after comparing them all, it turns out only 8 books are included on all 3 of the Guardian's chosen lists. 41 books from the newest list were also either on the 2002 list or the 2015 list. Actually, hilariously, it ended up being a completely even split, with 21 books being shared with the 2002 list and 20 books being shared with the 2015 list. At first, part of me felt like this was kind of bizarre and that there should be a lot more overlap. In 20 years, did our 100 best books of all time really change that drastically? But then if you put it into different terms and you really think of only choosing 100 important books over the course of literature is quite a big task. And so maybe it does make sense that these lists are constantly changing and evolving, particularly if we think of them maybe potentially evolving with what becomes particularly important in a given decade. What are the cultural and political climates that make maybe certain old influential books feel more important at the time? This year they also released a readers curated list because people didn't like their curated list. And so when we compare the 2026 Guardian list from what kind of like their authors and academics chose versus the readers list, there were 41 overlapping books, which means that readers agreed with under 50% of Guardian's initial choices, which I just think is sort of interesting. Something else I thought would be interesting was to look at the average year of all of these lists and see if the lists are getting more modern. For some reason, I had the idea that maybe they would be. Now, before I show you that data, let's be clear that we shouldn't put too much stock in the actual number for several reasons. One being a couple of the more famous books were collections, meaning that many of the things published in them were published in different years. So I just made sure I recorded those consistently. And then the first list in particular that was released in 2002, that one had a lot of writings that were written before the Common Era. And in that case, instead of using negative numbers, I just entered those all in as zeros. So obviously that makes the number not like a perfect year number. It does allow us to compare the average year of these publications over the lists. And it turns out my overall feelings were right. The 2002 list had an average date of 1661, while the 2015 had a date of 1911 and 2026 of 1929. Now, if we include the Reader's Choice from 2026, it also is a little bit more modern at 1936. It's interesting that the 2002 list is much less modern, including several things that were before the Common Era, versus 2015, 2026, and the Reader's Choice 2026 were more clustered together with about a decade in between them. That's just always interesting to me because I wonder as we make these lists if we tend to favor more modern books. Again, it wasn't by like a super statistically significant number. I didn't run, that side of test. I just think it's an interesting trend to think about. So why did I do that? Mostly to talk about the purposes of these lists. What is the purpose of these lists? I think too many people go in thinking that these are some definitive 100 best works that we must take as gospel truth. The Guardian stated that this list was to help people read again, which I think is kind of interesting, and I wonder if their original list would really accomplish that. For example, if I asked you 3 questions, I want you to make a list of 10 books, but I'm going to give you 3 different prompts. The first prompt is, what are your 10 favorite books of all time? The second prompt is, what are the 10 best books of all time? And the third prompt is, what are the 10 most important books of all time? Although these questions might seem similar, they're actually very different questions. And I know for me personally, my 3 lists would look very differently. There obviously would be some overlap, especially for considering the rule that you actually have to have read the books that you put on the list. But overall, the idea of favorite versus best versus more important do have different connotations. And I do think it's interesting as these lists come out more frequently, it's important to keep that in mind. What were the people being asked who were curating the lists? In my opinion, the first question, what are your 10 favorite books of all time, is actually the question that's most useful to getting people back into reading. However, the last question might be more important for establishing canon. The middle question, in my opinion, I think is actually the worst one, because how do you define best? And I think that's why these lists often feel so emotionally controversial, because I do feel like we often use the word best when putting out these lists. Because does best mean most interesting? Does best mean favorite? Does best mean contributed most to literature? It's a very ambiguous word. As I talked about in previous videos, I think there is kind of this push and pull now between the elite academic versus the everyday reader. And I think this has only intensified with this kind of weird middle ground of influencer that has risen in the last decade or so. The primary forces that used to drive sales were often the same as the academic elite. However, we really now have this influencer who has grown a platform and so has been elevated as separate from the everyday man, but really has no more qualifications than the everyday man. They've now become a considerable driver in novel economics. I think they are probably the biggest force right now in sales. And I think that can often cause this contention. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that both is good. We need both. Because I do think establishing canon is worthwhile. If you're unfamiliar with that term, canon is a word that describes works that are considered particularly important, significant, or influential. And while these works may or may not get you back into reading, sometimes they are really boring or difficult to get through. I think they can often be vitally important in making you a more informed and better reader. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Inspirations and tropes and writing conventions come from somewhere. And reading and understanding a lot of these foundational works that introduced a lot of those things into literature or introduced important political concepts or cultural concepts can deepen your understanding when they are reused in other formats and deepen your ability to really dig into a work and deconstruct it. There are so many things in canon over the years that are referenced a lot. The Bible is a great example. I remember in high school, we studied the Bible as literature because it is just referenced in so many things. And often most of us know enough to get by, but maybe understanding that deeper would change how you view things. You can think about Shakespeare. Shakespeare has totally altered our language, and references to that are all over so many works. Even more modern than that would be things like 1984 and the concept of Big Brother. Being able to read some of these seminal works are going to deepen your understanding and give you a better idea of the history of where a lot of our writing conventions come from. And That applies to everything, by the way. I think a lot of times we want to be like, well, that applies only to serious literature. No, your silly, fast-paced, fun, just what you would call popcorn reading are also going to be influenced by those things. These lists, I just think, shouldn't be taken as seriously as they are. I think they should be used as a jumping off point to explore and find out about new authors and writings that may be very important. There's so much literature, none of these lists can really cover it all. Academia and fun can and should exist together. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Oh, and by the way, we can't be turned off by pretension and then under the same breath decry the downfall of literacy. We can't make fun of how nobody understands anything anymore and then also say academia isn't important, okay? There's a reason they both need to coexist. Okay, that's it. I do think there's some interesting questions we can continue to ask about these lists. A couple I thought of was like, if we looked over the years of these lists, would we notice a change in the number of books written by women or written by people of color? How do the books potentially change based on the cultural and political climate of the time? What would genre-specific lists look like, and how important or unimportant would those be? Those do exist, by the way, but just how would they intersect? I think there's a lot of things to think about with these lists. But overall, I guess this was just a long way of saying we take them too seriously, and it's just a good place to get ideas. For me, I always try to incorporate one or two of these books a year into my reading list. Yes, a year, just one or two. Like, I just think there's an all or nothing attitude to it. It's like, gotta put in one or two, you know? Test the waters. Okay, let me know what you thought of this list. Let me know if you ever care about these lists. Let me know what you think about any of this. And if you want to see more of these kind of deep dives, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. Okay, see you next time. Bye.